Okay, so now we're going to look at a firm's production. So, in case you weren't aware, businesses, the way that they produce things is that they combine several different inputs, they bring them together, and those inputs are combined in such a way that they produce an output, right, which is basically the firm's product that it's going to sell. And so, to make things really simple for us, we're going to think about really there only being two types of inputs, labor and capital. So, of course, labor are the human inputs in terms of time worked, and capital is going to be basically almost pretty much everything else. So, raw materials, machinery, buildings, all those sorts of things, okay? And simplifying it in this way is going to make it easier for us to understand. Now, we can talk about something called the production function, which is basically an equation that tells us how the firm's inputs are converted into outputs. Okay, so here we see a production function, very generally defined, and it's basically telling us that the quantity of output per period is a function of capital and labor. Okay. Now, the reason we don't use C for capital is because we use C for consumption in macro. So we use K for capital here. So here we go. Right, there's a simple representation of a production function. Okay, so you know basically we can define this a little bit more specifically. And if you had numbers for these things, capital and labor, you could calculate using the production function how much output the firm could produce using those amounts of capital and labor. All right, so let's be sure that we understand what production is. It's simply any activity that results in the conversion of resources, in this case capital and labor, into products that can be used in consumption. So that's what we mean when we talk about production. It's simply converting inputs into outputs that can be consumed. And so the production function is just telling us about this relationship that exists between inputs and the output that is produced. In fact, it's telling us what is the maximum amount of output that can be produced given some amount of capital and labor in our case. So this is really telling us about the technological relationship between inputs and outputs. So if you'll recall, I've talked about the fact that technology in economics means more than just computers and electronics. It has a broader definition. It's basically it's the knowledge of how to produce something, and that knowledge is expressed in the production function, right? So that's how we tie production functions to technology. So let's think about a behavioral example. Is a firm's feasible output greater with individual or group structured tasks? So what do you guys think? Maybe take a second and think about this. If you want to pause the video, go ahead and do that. But in any case, there's been some recent research that has shown that when people are assigned to fixed groups, right, like teams within a firm, in order to perform tasks for several periods, it turns out the total production is typically higher, so a higher level of output, higher productivity, in other words, than when people perform the tasks individually. So it seems that working in teams allows for there to be some productivity gains, some increases in productivity. It's more efficient, in other words. However, if you assign people to random teams, right, so they're not on the same team for a repeated amount of time, they're kind of changing teams randomly here and there, maybe sporadically or whatever, then the performance of tasks by an individual actually can generate greater output. So this is interesting. It's not just the fact that having teams makes people more productive, it's the fact that they are on stable teams that they work with for long periods of time, which should make sense intuitively, right? If you've ever played a team sport, you know that when you've been with your teammates for a long time, you learn a lot about how they play, and you get to know how each other work well together. And then if you've ever changed teams, become part of a new team, it can take some time for there to be sort of a coherence built up. Trust, teamwork, those sorts of things take time to build. So this makes sense. So the conclusion is basically that in order to get the most productivity out of labor, we should have people in teams that are fixed, that are stable, not being changed randomly.